myself again. But it's the only way you're ever gonna learn. You look back and it's all in the past. I'm dwelling on the thoughts I cannot say to you. If I don't say the words, then maybe it's not true.
Hi, welcome to Steve Wraith's podcast. Delighted to welcome back Robin Perrie from The Sun. How are you, Robin?
I'm good, thanks. Good to be back.
Yeah, it is, and good to be back in the UK, I would imagine, after your trip across to the Ukraine. And of course, we had you on the show. You kindly came on whilst you were over there and give us a bit of a feeling of what it was like to experience war in Europe, something which I never thought I would ever find myself saying at any time. But you're back. Tell us a little bit about the trip out there first and foremost.
Well, I was out there for about 3 weeks, reporting every day, mostly from Lviv in the west, but also traveling around a little bit to where there'd been various attacks in the west. And it was a very eye-opening experience, just like yourself, really. It's the kind of experience I'd never thought we would ever have in our lifetimes, really. Very much felt like a World War II experience, on the ground in Europe. It was just incredible, and sadly is still going on, of course, for the poor people in Ukraine.
Yeah, no. It came across well. When we look at the interview, I'll stick the link down below as well for people to watch that back. But getting out there first and foremost, you must have been quite nervous.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think anybody, you'd be lying if you didn't say you're a bit apprehensive going into something like that. But it tends to be a case of, I think most journalists would probably say that once you're on the road and your mind is taken up with the practicalities of actually getting in, which clearly was a challenge. We flew into Budapest, picked up a car up in Budapest, drove into Slovakia, and then went across the Slovakian-Ukraine border. We was slightly roundabout route. The reason we did that was because the Polish-Ukraine border was just chaotic, with thousands of refugees coming out of there. So we took that slightly roundabout route to get in on a border crossing, which was a bit smoother. So that took a couple of days to get in there. And once your mind is tied up with the challenges of actually getting into the country, you sort of, the nerves vanish really, and you just sort of take on the job in hand.
Did you see much destruction on your arrival?
Well, the scene in the West is quite interesting. There have been attacks in the West, but they tend to be very targeted military attacks on areas like airfields where it's hard for the public and the press to actually get access to. So what you see in the West isn't really the sort of widespread destruction you see on the TV from the East, which is right on the front line. But what you do get in the West is very much a feeling of a country that is at war because the way the cities and towns have changed, which is incredibly marked, and interestingly became more marked in the time we were there. So when we arrived, there were some roadblocks, there were sort of fairly minor checkpoints, a few anti-tank defences, which was eye-opening enough as it was. But in the time we were there, that really ramped up. And by the time we left, it was a huge number of checkpoints. Every major road going into the big major cities had these massive checkpoints on, loads of anti-tank defences, huge structures made out of sandbags. And even going out into the countryside, in areas where you would assume weren't going to be military targets at all, every single little village, little hamlet had its own checkpoint manned by men from the village who mostly had left their jobs. A lot of businesses had closed down and they were spending their days manning these checkpoints. So it really was noticeable how the society just to observe it day-to-day basis had changed.
I remember reading your reports, and again, I can stick the link down for muckrack.com where a lot of your articles are. And you reported a few weeks ago that the morale of the Russian troops was collapsing. Was that still the case when you left?
Yeah, I think very much so, and is in a stark contrast, obviously, is the morale of the Ukrainian people, and I know I made a special point of commenting on that in our first interview, but it is worth repeating that. The will of the will and the spirit of the Ukrainian people was just incredible. It really was a case of they felt, they were the victims of a utterly unjustified military action, and to a man and to a woman, they were determined that they were not going to, let this aggressor rolling and take over their country. And we were getting repeated reports again and again of conscripts in the Russian army. They're just, many of whom we were told weren't really even fully aware of what military action they were being sent on. Some of them thought it was a military exercise, and there just didn't seem to be the same, strength of will within the Russian troops as there was within the Ukrainian troops. It appears that the conflict is now sort of shifting once again. Russia seems to have abandoned their positions in the north and around Kiev, and then now they're concentrating everything in the east, in the Donbass region, which has been a sort of an area of conflict since 2014. And there's been a sort of, I guess, an improvement in some of the Russian military tactics. They've apparently appointed one commander to take charge of all their forces in the east. So I guess they are hoping there's going to be more of a concentrated effort to take on the Ukrainian forces down there. And Western military officials have advised that there is going to be, a ramping up and a concentration of military action and conflict in that area. So it sadly doesn't seem that it's going to come to an end anytime soon.
I mean, it looks as if it could be, it could drag on for, the rest of this year and beyond. It's something which, of course, hasn't just happened overnight. This has been building up probably for the last, 8 to 10 years.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in 2014, when there was a change in government in the Ukraine in a way that Putin wasn't happy with, that's triggered the annexation of Crimea. And there's these two separatist areas in the east, in the Donbass region, Donetsk and Luhansk. And there has been a conflict there, which hasn't been hugely reported in the West since 2014, but it has been rumbling on. And as you say, it's a good point. I mean, this does feel like it's going to roll on. And it's been reported today how there's going to a new commander of NATO forces in Europe has been appointed, an American general who's a fluent Russian speaker, and it kind of gives an idea as to where the West and America and NATO feel like that the next generation of conflict is going to be based. We've just come out of 2 decades, of course, of action against ISIS and Al Qaeda post 9/11, and it kind of feels that this generational shift really to a different style of conflict, so that it's going to maybe be dominant for all of our lives, present in all of our lives for years to come.
Why do you think that Vladimir Putin chose now?
Well, it is hard to sort of know what's triggered this, and it seemed to have come as a surprise to everybody, including the Ukrainian people. We were all aware of the build-up on the border for many weeks and months, but no one thought he would actually do it. He clearly feels that NATO is expanding too far. I guess Zelensky was a popular leader even before this war, and I guess the increasing popularity of a Western-looking leader who was keen to join the EU and NATO clearly meant that Putin felt he wanted to act to sort of halt this march, as he sees it, of NATO towards his border. But it's much deeper than that, more complex, and I do think it goes back to a long-running feeling that Putin has that he's never quite got over the collapse of the Soviet Union all them years ago.
Your work in, when you were there as a journalist, propaganda is a big part of war. What was the media coverage like in Ukraine?
Yeah, I mean, it is something you're conscious of, and obviously the Western media is very sympathetic towards the Ukrainian cause, and the Ukrainian government was incredibly proactive in putting out a lot of material sort of every day. And unashamedly, they were sort of like doing it in a bid to raise the morale of their people, and casting the Russian side in a negative light, understandably. The Ukrainian media was incredibly sort of proactive in that sense. And I think it's something I mentioned before. Actually, it was interesting that it's kind of maybe it is the first wide scale conflict that's occurred in an age of social media. The Ukrainian government used a Telegram channel, social media app to communication app to put out huge amounts of material every single day, which is very useful to the media. You know, it's updating you constantly, kind of thing. But it sort of just feeds into it. It's a kind of a mass of material that comes out every single day, and it is very hard, undoubtedly, for everybody to really get down to the nitty gritty to prove every single fact that you're being told, as evidenced by the claims report yesterday of a potential chemical weapons attack. It does look significant. It could be a chemical weapons attack, and it could obviously mark a huge step change in the approach of the West and NATO if it's proved. But that's a critical point, because it's incredibly difficult to prove a chemical weapons attack and who was actually behind it. Russia undoubtedly will claim that Ukraine did the attack itself in a false flag attempt to discredit Russia. You know, it's proving these things is incredibly difficult in a war zone.
Yeah, there's no doubt about that. And I mean, the threat of not just chemical weapons, but nuclear weapons is a threat that hangs over us all. Yeah,
absolutely. It's something we remember, of course, from our childhood, the 70s, if you're old enough to remember certainly the 80s. And of course, we thought that, you know, post the Berlin Wall coming down, the collapse of the Soviet Union, we thought that had all gone. And as I said earlier, post 9/11, it was kind of a different kind of conflict that we were all kind of used to. But yeah, this is coming back, and it is a worrying time.
I think the most harrowing story that I read when you were out there was of the Ukrainian mum of 12 who was on the front line fighting, who was killed.
Yeah, it's absolutely, and then that goes back, doesn't it, to sort of showing the spirit of the Ukrainian people. You know, that somebody like that in the UK would never go to the front line, but in Ukraine they do, and that shows the kind of commitments that people from all aspects of society, all ages, are willing to go. And sadly, you know, 12 of her children have now been left without a mother.
Yeah, and as we know, death is part of war. There's been many casualties on both sides, but babies are still being born, and you did a wonderful story about babies being born in basements. I mean, you've seen both sides of it.
Yeah, absolutely. That was incredible. It was one of the most moving stories we did. It was a woman who'd spent it was her first baby, so she was apprehensive as any woman is of giving birth to her first child, and she prepared for that by spending weeks in the shelter beneath her apartment block. Then they managed to get to the hospital just in time. She gave birth. Within hours, she was back in another shelter, and then eventually managed to finally flee her town, which is right on the border with Russia, on a bus that was fired upon by Russian troops, and she ended up on the floor shielding her 10-day-old baby with her own body to bullets slammed into the side of the bus. It was just an incredible story, and hopefully one day I'll go back and do a follow-up with that lady, perhaps, you know, when things are calmer and the peace is broken out, and it would be lovely to catch up with her again, because there were some incredible stories like that. One of the most moving images or memories for me, I guess, was at the very end when I came out of Ukraine. I came out across the border into Poland by foot. The situation there, the refugee situation, was a lot calmer by then, but there were still many people coming out, and so I joined that queue of people. It was about a 2-hour wait to cross the border into Poland. And there was quite a few hundred people lining up, and you funnel into this one queue through the passport control. And I hadn't really sort of been aware until at the very end that there was a young family in front of me. It was a mum, dad, and a young child of about 4. And it was only at the very, very end I sort of like reminded myself that, of course, Ukrainian men aren't allowed to leave. They've got to stay in the country to fight. And so at the very end, this dad, so I gave his wife a big kiss and a big hug and knelt down and had this big long talk to his son and gave him a big hug. And it suddenly struck me. I thought, of course, he's not leaving. He's saying goodbye to his wife and child, and he's going to go back into Ukraine as they leave to go into Poland. And of course, who knows when he'll see them again? Who knows if he'll ever see them again? And we've all read those stories for weeks on end. I'd reported them from afar, and we'd read them in the press. But to actually see it in front of your eyes, and that a family being broken up, mum, child leaves, dad stays, it was incredibly moving. You'd have to have a heart of stone not to be moved by that.
Yeah, and it gets back to the morale side of things as well when we look at some of the celebrities who've stood and fought alongside, you know, people in this war. You know, world heavyweight champion Klitschko. We've seen,
Yeah.
you know, Usyk, you know, on the front line. We've seen a tennis player putting down his racket and picking up an MK47. I mean, it's bizarre to see this, you know, unfold in front of our eyes in the modern day.
It is, yeah, it is. And those people do have a sort of value, of course. You know, I mean, you know, in peaceful times, you know, sometimes celebrities can become famous and role models for trivial issues like reality TV kind of thing. But they do have a profile. They do have many fans, and these sports stars kind of thing. You know, they've earned their right to be. To have that profile, they've achieved incredible things, and then all of a sudden, as you say, they're in the headlines for other reasons, but I think they do it. They do inspire the population, you know. Someone like Klitschko, you know, he's a warrior, isn't he? And he's a leader now in Kiev in peacetime, and you know, he's now a wartime leader in his own right. And I think people need that. Society needs those people to keep their morale up. And Zelensky, of course, has played that role incredibly effectively. Very early on in the conflict, I think it was Biden, but certainly saw the West sort of gave him the opportunity to leave Kiev to make sure he remained safe, and he turned that down. He said, "No, I've got to stay." And I think it's a fascinating aspect, that, and these things sometimes can turn on the smallest of decisions. And of course, if he'd have left Kiev and maybe he's even just stayed within the country, maybe he's gone to Lviv in the west, which is safer. It was safer. You know, people might have had a little bit of a drop in morale, but he stayed there. He stayed right in the middle of it all, and did the video update every day when he was on video in Kiev, and I think that empowered the people and give them a greater degree of belief that they could win.
I was going to ask you about Zelensky. I mean, you know, watching him from afar, he's akin to Winston Churchill during, you know, the Second World War in the UK, where he stood up and was counted, and you know, we still look back fondly on his time as Prime Minister, War Prime Minister, getting us through, you know, to VE Day and D Day, etc. in 45. But yeah, he comes out of this so far with a lot of credit.
Absolutely, incredibly well, and I think he will be remembered. You know, within Ukraine, he'll be remembered. You know, it's a good analogy. He'll be remembered for as long and in the same way that we remember Churchill. And it might sound a bit of a weird thing to say this at this stage, because you don't quite realise history is being made sometimes when it is being made. But I think that will be the case, because make no bones about it. You know, this is a hugely significant chapter in Ukraine and Russia's history, and you know, understandably, it's going to trigger hatred by Ukrainian people of Russia for what they have done to them, you know, to their towns, to their families, for generations, and at the heart of that new view of Russia and new view of itself by Ukraine is going to be Zelensky. He's played an incredible role, incredibly powerful, and with the way, of course, he keeps speaking to foreign governments. He keeps appearing, doesn't he, by video link, speaking to different countries all over the world, and he pulls no punches. He keeps demanding help, and he makes the point, and I think it's a valid point, that if it's not just Ukraine, this affects the whole of the West, the whole of the Western world, and if a stand isn't made against Putin, then who knows where he goes next.
What is the abiding memory that you're going to take from this particular story and your trip to the Ukraine?
A couple of things, really. I mean, I've mentioned one already. Undoubtedly, that leaving over that border and viewing that family really brought it home to you. On the similar experience at the railway station in Lviv, but on a much bigger scale. In the first few days of when we arrived, it was a chaotic situation. There was thousands of people arriving, so ill-equipped for what the trek they were having been forced to go on across Europe to find a new home. There was kids carrying bags which they clearly just take their school books to school on an every day, and women, their mothers, were carrying one suitcase. They were carrying cats in carrier bags. Just like enough belongings that could cram in a couple of bags, and they were crossing into Germany, Poland, and then Germany further afield. That's something take with me. The air raid sirens you hear every night, and the roadblocks I've mentioned a few times. One little thing is, on the day I left our hotel, there was a car that had appeared in the car park, and it had the word children written in Ukrainian, or Russian, probably, I would think, on a sign, on a piece of A4 paper, sellotaped to the back windscreen. And this is something that was seen a lot over in the East, so, in the hope, in perhaps vain hope, that it would persuade Russian soldiers not to fire on that car because there was children inside it. So that car had obviously driven right from the east across to the west. Ukraine's a huge country. That journey must have taken a couple of days. And of course, we saw that as well. That was written on the road, on the pavement outside that theatre in Mariupol that was attacked. And sadly, it didn't stop the Russians attacking that target. So thankfully, this car didn't have any damage whatsoever. It had made it out of the east. But that one little sort of image, when a desperate attempt by some parents to plead with the Russian soldiers from afar, don't attack us, we've got kids in the car. It shows what a desperate situation so many people found themselves in.
Yeah, tragic circumstances, but something I'm sure that you will remember for the rest of your life. And let's hope that things can resolve sooner rather than later. Just a quick mention, because we are going to get you back on the show in a couple of weeks' time. Just about your new book. Tell us a little bit about it.
Yeah, so I've just had my first book published. It's called I'm the Yorkshire Ripper, and it's kind of the definitive life story of Peter Sutcliffe. It's based on a huge, massive raw material that I had access to by somebody who became one of the closest people to him outside of his immediate family. Had a relationship with him over about 16 years. So had a huge amount of raw material, hundreds of letters and phone conversations, and it's basically this sort of fascinating, most in-depth, detailed story of Britain's most notorious ever serial killer.
Fantastic. Well, I'm looking forward to getting you back on the show to discuss that, mate. Robin Perrie from The Sun, thank you very much for giving us time just to give us an insight into what it was like in the Ukraine. Take care, mate.
Thanks for having me on again. Thanks, Steve.
Cheers. Bye-bye.